In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. It's the 12th month, the 25th day in the year 2015, and it's Christmas Day. Christ is truly born.
Hallelujah. Hallelujah.
And don't let the apostate Jews or anyone else lie to you. Christ, the Messiah, is truly born. As a matter of fact, I just spoke with him this morning. The title of the lecture this Christmas 2015 season is The Hellenization of Christianity by the Scholastics. But I first invoke the help of the Holy Infant Jesus on this Christmas day to go before me, to grant me all the graces and all the helps I need, to fill my heart with the love of God, the love of the truth, and the hatred of all sin and false religions, so that I may be able to expose and not completely continue to knock down this mountain of the glorification of philosophy and mythology. And I invoke the Holy Infant Jesus especially to go before me during this lecture. Without God, we can't do anything good. We can't think anything good with a good motive. Now, last Christmas, which was Christmas 2014, the title of that lecture was Hellenization of Christianity by the Anti-Church Fathers. But this year, we're going to talk about the Scholastics. Last year, it was the Anti-Church Fathers. Now we're going to talk about the Scholastics. As you remember, last year, the Anti-Church Fathers Hellenized Christianity in a big way in the 3rd and 4th centuries. Then it was put down and simmered underground. But then it rose again in the 11th century, in the 1000s, when Satan was unchained. And that's when the great apostasy began. And then the Scholastics began to Hellenize Christianity the same way that the Anti-Church Fathers did. Now we're going to concentrate on the Scholastics during this lecture. Now, as I said last year even, there's 5 major mountains of the great apostasy that need to be knocked down. The first one was the Vatican II Church, exposing that. The second one was the Catholic Church teaching that formal heretics cannot hold offices in the Catholic Church, which tells us that all these so-called popes, bishops, and cardinals that are formal heretics never held an office. Third, canonizations are not infallible. Very big. So you don't follow these anti-church fathers and these so-called saints that are not saints, that are teaching abominable heresies and idolatries and immoralities. So you don't idolize these people and follow them. That's a very key issue. Fourth was exposing the Renaissance Church, which I actually did that in the Great Apostasy and the Unchaining of Satan. Now, that's the 4th mountain. The 5th mountain was exposing the anti-church fathers, which I did last year. Now, the Scholastics are part of the 4th mountain. They're part of the Renaissance Church. For the Renaissance actually started in the 11th century when the great apostasy began, which consists of the glorification of philosophy and mythology. That's when it began. And that's when scholasticism began to succeed. Now, you always had the glorification of philosophy and mythology when it was a simmering underground. A few people held it. It never succeeded. They held it in secret or semi-secret, and it never really succeeded. It began to succeed again in the 11th century. So we're going to go over the whole history of that during this lecture. We're also going to mention that the scholastics, every one of them, glorified philosophy. Every one of them. Now, all of them also glorified mythology, but in one of 2 ways. They either glorified mythology by sins of omission and association, by allowing the desecration of Catholic places with images against the faith, all right, which desecrated Catholic churches through Europe. They never said anything about it. They never condemned it. They never denounced the people that were doing it. Or some of the scholastics actually glorified mythology explicitly. They liked it and they loved it. Not all of them. Some of them did. Now, you also had some of the people during the Renaissance era that glorified mythology but not philosophy. But under the title of all these people, all these anti-church fathers, these scholastics, they're all titled humanists. And these other people that just glorified mythology, they're all humanists. Every one of them is a humanist. So now when I give this lecture, I'm concentrating mostly on the scholastics, who primarily, all of them, glorify philosophy. But I'm only going to really deal with the period of time dealing from the 11th century to the 14th century. My other sermons on the Great Apostasy dealt with the 15th century forward and shows you how bad it was then. It just proceeded. We're getting to the beginning of it here in this lecture. Okay? Now, so we're going to deal mostly with the philosophical part, the glorification of philosophy by the scholastics. Now, we're first going to start out by defining what is philosophy. Well, philosophy means the love of wisdom, and philosopher means a lover of wisdom. Now, the wisdom of philosophy is religious. which I'm going to prove to you right now. Now, what does religion consist of? Religion teaches about God, or gods, or there is no God, teaches about how all things came to be, what is the nature of man, what is his purpose in life, how is he to behave, and what happens to him after he dies. This is religion, okay? Now, because philosophy tries to answer all these questions, it is indeed a religion. Very important. Now, we're going to quote from the Nominal Catholic Encyclopedia from the article on philosophy. In the opinion of the present writer, the most exact and comprehensive definition is that of Aristotle, of philosophy. Face to face with nature and with himself, man reflects and endeavors to discover what the world is and what he is himself. He is led to study the whole, to inquire into the principles or reasons of the totality of things, a study which rests upon all that is and all that becomes. And thus philosophy is the profound knowledge of the universal order. The expression universal order should be understood in the widest sense. Man is one part of it, hence the relations of man with the world of sense and with its author belong to the domain of philosophy. Yearning for religion was stirring in the world, and philosophy became enamored of every religious doctrine. Plotinus, the 3rd century after Christ, who must always remain the most perfect type of Neoplatonic mentality, makes philosophy identical with religion, assigning as its highest aim the union of the soul with God by mystical ways. And the apostate, I put this in here, apostate, John Scotus Erigene in the 9th century writes that true religion is true philosophy, and conversely, true philosophy is true religion. And St. Augustine says, his book on true religion, and section 8, it is taught and believed as a chief point that philosophy, the pursuit of wisdom, cannot be divorced from religion. So now we proved that philosophy is a religion. Now, because philosophy is a religion, that means the only true philosophy and true wisdom is that of the one true religion, which during the New Covenant era is only Catholicism, and under the Old Covenant era was Judaism. That's the only true philosophy and the only true wisdom. Because the philosophies of the unbelievers do not teach about the true God, nor worship or believe in him, nor teach about all these religious things correctly. They're false religions. Just like Hinduism, Islam, Buddhism, Talmudic Judaism. They're all false religions. Very important to understand that concept of what we're talking about here. Because the philosophies of unbelievers like Plato and Aristotle do not teach about the true God, nor worship or believe in the true God, nor answer all the questions about religion correctly. They are false religions. We're now going to read from some of the church fathers and other quotes about how the difference between the true philosophy of Catholicism and the true wisdom, as opposed to the false philosophy and false wisdom of the unbelieving philosophers like Plato and Aristotle. We're going to quote from St. John Chrysostom in his homilies on statues, homily 19. These are our philosophers, Catholics, and theirs is the best philosophy, Catholicism. These have their souls adorned with the doctrines of the true philosophy, Catholicism. The pagan philosophers have nothing to show. Let the Gentiles then be ashamed. Let them hide their heads and slink away on account of their philosophers and their wisdom, wretched as it is beyond all folly. St. Augustine says in his book of True Religion, however, philosophers may boast. Anyone can easily understand that religion is not to be sought from them, for their schools teach divergent and contrary opinions about the nature of their gods and of the chief good. You don't learn religion from them. St. Augustine, in his book, The City of God, teaches, philosopher's very name, if rendered into Latin, signifies those who profess the love of wisdom. Now, if wisdom is God, who made all things, as is attested by the divine authority and truth, then the philosopher is a lover of God. But since the thing itself, which is called by this name, exists not in all who glory in the name. For it does not follow, of course, that all who are called philosophers are lovers of true wisdom. The Christian is warned by the precept of the apostle and faithfully hears what has been said. Beware that no one deceive you through philosophy and vain deceit. That's what St. Paul's, Colossians 2:8. Where the apostle would have us understand him as meaning the Romans, the Greeks, and Egyptians who glory in the name of wisdom. The Christian knows well, too, to be on his guard against these philosophers in their errors. For even if some true things were said by them, yet falsehoods were uttered by them with the same license. Hence, the grace of God is necessary for the acquisition, not indeed of any philosophy, but of the true philosophy. The true philosophy, the sole support against the miseries of this life, has been given by heaven only to a few. It has been given to that nation, that people, that city, that republic, these Israelites to whom the oracles of God were entrusted. They by no means confounded false prophets with true prophets, but agreeing together and differing in nothing, acknowledged and upheld the authentic authors of their sacred books. These were their philosophers, the philosophers of the Israelites, the prophets. These were their sages, divines, prophets, and teachers of probity and piety. Whoever was wise and lived according to them was wise and lived not according to men, but according to God who has spoken by them. Again, the true philosophy only exists during the New Covenant era with Catholicism and under the Old Covenant with Judaism. All the other philosophies are false, not to be followed. They're false religions. Now, just to give you a little proof about somebody who says they teach contrary things and a lot of falsehoods, we're going to just list some of the errors of Plato and Aristotle. I mention those two because they're the most famous. So I'm going to mention some of the errors of Plato and Aristotle. I'm not going to show you where they're taught. My book's going to have all that. By the way, all this stuff I'm talking in this lecture is covered in my book in way more detail than I'm going over now. The book is still almost completed, as I keep saying. It's probably going to be about 600 or 700 pages. It's the biggest book I ever wrote, most important. But it will be coming out in a couple of months, 2, 3, 4 months. I hate to say when, but but this is just giving you the information that will show you where Plato taught these things in Aristotle. But here's what Plato believed in. Well, a lot of people, we should follow Plato and learn from Plato. Plato was a man of God, or we can learn how to be virtuous, or we need to study him so we can learn better our faith. Plato did not believe in original sin. He believed in and worshipped many gods. He believed that demons mediate before the gods. He believed that men's souls are demons. He believed souls are co-eternal with God. He believed that the stars, earth, and other planets are eternal gods. He believed that men reincarnate into beasts. He believed that wives should mate with young, strong men and thus commit adultery. He believed that all things that God created are eternal, thus always existed. Other people say he also believed in homosexuality. Aristotle did not believe in original sin. He believed God's providence does not extend to the earth. He believed that space and the stars are God's body. He believed that the moon is Minerva. He believed men can be truly happy and virtuous without faith. And he believed all things that God created are eternal and thus always exist. It's just proof that these are false religions, no different than Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, you name it. Whatever, it's in the category of a false religion. Now, understanding that, I think most people, what I already told you, are going to understand how abominable, how heretical, how idolatrous this next heresy is, which was taught by apostate anti-popes and your scholastics. They teach that philosophy, and they're talking about the philosophy unbelievers, is a handmaid to theology. Theology is the Catholic religion. They're saying that philosophy is a very good thing to study, and a lot of people say you even need to study it because it'll help you to understand theology or the Catholic religion better. That's like saying a false religion is a handmaid to the true religion. Satan is a handmaid to Christ. It's no different than saying that Buddhism is a handmaid to theology, or Islam is a handmaid to theology, or Talmudic Judaism is a handmaid to theology. When you say philosophy is a handmaid to theology, you're saying a false religion is a handmaid to theology. Well, if theology in the Catholic religion is the only true philosophy, it doesn't need a handmaid. It is the true philosophy. Our true Catholic religion teaches everything you need to know about faith and morals in and of itself. It needs no help, especially from a false religion or from anyone else. So when you say that philosophy is a handmaid to theology, it's an abomination. And I'm going to quote some of these heretics that taught this. First, you're going to see when it started. We're reading from church history by the apostate Father Lau, and he says, this new theology, which used philosophy and the conclusions of the natural science, insofar as they were known at the time as its handmaids, is called scholasticism. And we went a little bit over this last year even. We were talking about how they say you need to study these things to help you understand Christianity better. These things are the milk, the Christianity is the meat. They took St. Paul's teachings out of context. And they're telling you that it's good to learn these things, to be edified and enlightened by them. Now we read the apostate Thomas Aquinas in his Summa Theologica taught this. He says, this science, the sacred doctrine and theology, can in a sense depend upon the philosophical sciences. It depends upon them. It makes use of them as handmaidens. That's the apostate Thomas Aquinas talking about philosophy. Aristotle was his big idol who he loved. He was edified by him, enlightened by him, took down his revelations, and he considered the false religion of Aristotle as a handmaiden to the Catholic religion, the true religion. This is what he taught. They all believed this. The Scholastics. Now, Apostate Pope Pius X also taught this in Pacendi Dominici Gregis in 1907, paragraph 18 and 46. I read, our predecessor Pius IX says that in matters of a religion, it is the duty of philosophy not to command but to serve. How could a false religion serve a true religion? What possible service could it give us or help us in our religion? All you can do with false religions is to refute them. You know, that's historical, educational, refutational purpose. It doesn't help us. It's a false religion. He says the duty of philosophy is to serve theology and to wait upon it after the manner of a handmaiden. There it is. So what they were saying is, well, we're not teaching that, philosophy is the only thing, but we're mixing it with Christianity. That's the Hellenization of Christianity. We're mixing the false religions of these unbelieving philosophers with Christianity. And when you say it's a handmaid, you say it's good, but theology's above it, but this is still good. You're mixing it. It's called syncretism. It's like saying we need that Hinduism is a handmaid to Christianity. The theology, or Buddhism, is a handmaid to theology. It's the exact same thing as what these guys are saying. Now, we're going to get into another important topic here, what a true and a false definition of what philosophy is. It's important because there's a little confusion on this issue here. It comes down to the fact, a lot of people said that, or at least the Scholastics say, they try to pin that philosophy is the handmaid of theology on Peter Damian. But Peter Damian never taught that. Never. He hated philosophy. But we got to make a difference now, a distinction between what we're talking about here when it comes to philosophy and what other people considered was philosophy. People put into the category of philosophy logic, dialectics, rhetoric, and grammar. That's not philosophy. It's not philosophy at all, no more than is music or geometry or arithmetic. It's not philosophy. But back the Scholastics, and you're going to read about that as we go on, I got the quotes here, where they considered that philosophy. But here's what Peter Damian teaches. First, here's where they talk about Peter Damian teaching this. This is from the History of the Christian Philosophy in the Middle Ages by apostate Etienne Gilson. He says, in his Divina Omnipotentia, Peter maintains that philosophy should serve Holy Scriptures as a maid serves her mistress. But he doesn't really teach that. This text is one of the origins of the oft-quoted formula, philosophy the handmaid of theology, which, however, is not found in Peter Damian, at least not in so many words. Not in so many words. You're right. I'm going to quote you the words. He doesn't teach that. It's a big lie. They try to pin it on him. Okay? I'm going to show you what he teaches. It's from his De Divine Omnipotentia, which is letter 119, from 1064. Here's Peter Damian. Clearly, conclusions drawn from the arguments of dialecticians and rhetoricians should not be thoughtlessly addressed to the mysteries of divine power. Dialecticians and rhetoricians should refrain from persistently applying to the sacred laws the rules devised for their progress and using the tools of syllogisms or the style of oratory, and from setting their inevitable conclusions against the power of God. However, if the techniques of the humanities be used in the study of revelation, they must not arrogantly usurp the rights of the mistress, but should humbly assume a certain ancillary road as a maid served to her lady. He's talking about dialectics and rhetorics. Very important. We're going to tell you what that is in a minute, define for it. So as not to be led astray in assuming the lead, nor to lose the enlightenment of the deepest virtue, nor abandon the right road to truth by attending only to the superficial meaning of the words. Very important. Dialectics means basically a dialogue between two or more persons concerning the truth, who's right and who's wrong. It's a debate. Two or more people hold differing opinions, and it's a dialogue between them as to who's right and who's wrong. And you apply logic and all that. Now, dialectics, which was taught by the Greeks, you don't really need to be taught that. Men have that by the natural law. St. Paul even used dialectics in the scriptures when he's refuting people, discussing things with people. So there's nothing wrong. Dialectics is not intrinsically evil. And neither is rhetoric. Means learning how to speak properly, a good orator. So he can speak and convince people of his words. Now, if he's an honest orator and he teaches the truth, that's a very good thing. If he's a dishonest orator, then he's going to use tricks. He's going to use what I call false rhetoric. But rhetoric is not evil, intrinsically, learning how to speak properly or grammar. So we're going to get into that right now. Now, the Scholastics, though, considered dialectics and rhetorics philosophy. So that's what they're saying. Peter Damon said philosophy is a handmaid to theology. No, he didn't. And dialectics and rhetoric, I'm sorry, is not philosophy. You're going to read where they thought this. This is from the Nominal Catholic Encyclopedia article on philosophy. The early Middle Ages, with a rudimentary scientific culture, regarded all of its learning built up on the trivium, which is grammar, rhetoric, and dialectic, and the quadrivium, which is arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. In the 13th century, when scholasticism came under Aristotelian influences, it incorporated the sciences in the program of philosophy itself. They called all those things I just read to you philosophy. That's not philosophy. It doesn't teach about God and about religious things. It's no, you calling arithmetic philosophy? Calling music philosophy? Geometry, philosophy, astronomy? It's not. That's the deception sometimes when they throw the curveball. And they got away with saying, Peter Damien was saying philosophy is a handmaid to theology. No, he didn't. He taught rhetoric and dialectics as a handmaid, not philosophy. Now, when St. Paul came out and said, beware of philosophy, he didn't mean beware of grammar. He didn't mean beware of learning how to speak. There's not, and in a sense, too, what Peter Damien said is true. You could say that learning the alphabet or learning how to speak proper English is a handmaiden to people who want to be theologians because they need to learn how to read. They need to learn how to write properly so people can understand them. They need to know how to speak properly. Now, some people have it naturally. But when you're learning those things, they could be handmaids to theology because it's not a religion. They're sciences that are non-religious, and they're intrinsically not evil. They're actually good things. So there's a deception going on with that. So St. Paul never meant to condemn those things. Okay, so then what is true philosophy? Philosophical works. I call them philosophical works. Those are works whose sole purpose is to deal with God, gods, or that there is no God, for religious topics. Faith and morals. That's philosophical works. That's your true philosophical works. All right, now we got to make a distinction here because when the Scholastics believed all these dialectics and grammar was philosophy also, we already proved that that's not really philosophy. Now, they were also, the philosophers, the unbelieving philosophers like Plato and Aristotle and Cicero did write books that dealt with logic, dialectics, rhetoric, and grammar. And in particular, the Scholastics first became corrupted by reading these books because it wouldn't be bad if there was if there was nothing against faith and morals in these books. But for instance, they were learning logic and dialectics from Aristotle, they were learning rhetoric from Cicero, and they were learning grammar from the Priscian grammar. But the problem with that is they were using philosophical examples in these books about their false gods, their false teachings about religion. They were actually inserting their philosophical beliefs within their grammar books, their logic books, their dialectic books. That is absolutely the first way the theologians became corrupted with scholasticism. They were not studying Aristotle's and Cicero's philosophical works, because that was banned. But they were studying their works on logic, dialectics, rhetoric, and grammar that were unpurged from their errors. And so they were learning philosophy. The Priscian grammar would say Jupiter was born, was a son of Saturnus or whatever. And they would teach about mythology in there. They would teach about their false religious beliefs. And that's where they were getting their philosophy from. They were supposed to only be studying logic, and grammar and rhetoric, but they were learning philosophy. And that's the first way that most of your theologians became corrupted. Later on, then, they were allowed to read the philosophical works. That sole purpose was just to teach philosophy. That came out later on. But that's the first way it began. They began to get corrupted. Now, so as you're saying, even these non-religious courses, such as geometry or astronomy, they could even contain heresies. Astronomy is in of itself not intrinsically evil. But if you teach that the sun is at the center of the universe and immovable and not the earth, if you teach heliocentrism, you got to purge that out of your astronomy. You can't learn astronomy from a book like that until the errors are purged out of it. So if you're going to use Aristotle's logic and dialectics, you've got to purge all the errors out of it. Same thing with Cicero's rhetoric or Priscian's grammar. Actually, what they do with the grammar books too, they use Catholic examples instead of pagan examples. They use examples defending the Catholic religion instead of false religions of philosophy. You got to purge these books before you can use them. But they weren't doing that. They were using the unpurged versions. So here's what we say here. We say if a Catholic is going to take logic, it has to be true logic, true dialectics, true rhetoric, and correct grammar. Secondly, some methods, here, now I'm going to give you some of the methods that there is a false logic, there also is a false dialectic, and a false rhetoric. This is another point we're going to get into. Their dialectics and rhetoric was specifically formulated to deceive people, to make them believe lies, or to be ambiguous. And that's what I call a false dialectic, a false rhetoric, a false logic. Its whole purpose is that they can get up there, and their whole thing was, I'm going to get up there and tell people something that I know is a lie. I'm going to convince them of it as if it's the truth. And this is evil. That's what I call, so even if the dialectics is purged from its false religious beliefs and its mythological gods, you also have to have true logic and true rhetoric and true dialectics. It can't be false. Now, here's some of the methods of the false logic, the false dialectics, and the false rhetorics of the philosophers and scholastics. They present truth and error equally before saying what is the truth. They want the truth to be questioned, so that even when they come up with the truth, they say, don't believe me, question it. You're always questioning the truth. They present what they know is an error as truth because of pride, because they don't want to admit they're wrong. They don't want it, so they're actually purposely defending something they know to be a lie. And they also present truth and error without saying which is true and which is false. So you're reading it and your head's going in circles. This is false logic, false dialectic, false rhetoric. Be careful of that. That's what the unbelieving philosophers practiced. That's what the scholastics practice. Also, reason and true logic and true dialectics must not be used with dogmas that are above human reason. This is another very key point. Even true logic, true dialectics, true rhetoric, in which you can use your reason on things that we can reasonably understand is fine. But when you use them with dogmas that are above the understanding of man, human reasoning, that's when you get all messed up. And all the philosophers, that's one of their key problems. They want to reason everything out by their intellect, and if they can't reason it out, they have no room for faith. Now the scholastics, they put faith in second place. So really, they have reason usurping faith. And because they won't say, I deny faith altogether. There's a few things they say, I know you got to believe, that are above human understanding. But because they idolize the intellect and say the intellect comes above faith, the brain is over the heart, the intellect is over the will, reason is over faith, because they believe that, they end up sooner or later on one or more points trying to reasonably explain a dogma that's above human understanding, and they get all messed up. That's what the philosophers do. That's what they do. Regarding the Holy Eucharist, we're going to read about examples on it, and they get all messed up. So, and some of them even come out to say, you're going to read, that say, I think every dogma can be explained by human reason, which is arrogant. That's like saying, I'm God. Only God can know everything by reason. So even when you're using true logic, true dialectics, and true rhetoric, you got to make sure that you don't try to use your logic and dialectics with dogmas that are above the understanding of human reason. Then also, for true logic, true dialectics, and true rhetoric, and correct grammar must not contain anything contrary to the Catholic faith or morals. It must be purged of all its teachings against the Catholic faith or morals. Now we're going to get into another thing. That's fine if you're purging a dialectic book or a rhetoric book. But we're going to talk about Apostate Pope Gregory IX, who's one of the first apostate popes that really gave explicit approval of philosophical teachings. While he condemned some parts of it, he approved huge parts of it. And in 1231, when the University of Paris was reopened, and it was closed for 2 years, from 1229 to 1231, he wrote this letter, and we'll explain what I'm saying here after I write. It's called the Statutes for the University of Paris, 1231. apostate anti-Pope Gregory IX. Paris, the mother of the sciences, like another Karef Sefer, a city of letters, shines forth illustrious, great indeed, but concerning herself she causes greater things to be desired, full of favor for teaching and his students. He's glorifying the University of Paris as a cesspool of iniquity. We order that those books on natural philosophy is what they put in the category of philosophical works. They call them metaphysics. It's works that deal with religion. So he's saying philosophical works that deal with religion, and he says, and those books on natural philosophy, philosophical works, which for a certain reason were prohibited in a provincial council, the provincial councils in Paris prohibited the works, the philosophical works of Aristotle and Plato, are not to be used in Paris until they have been examined and purged of all suspicion and error. Well, that sounds out kind of good on the outside, right? But there's a big problem with that. We're now talking about philosophical works. Their whole purpose is to teach about religion and God. So what's the point of purging? If I purge them and get rid of all their errors, what am I left with? For example, if I purge Aristotle's philosophical works and all that's left is the truth, I got Catholicism. It's not Aristotle. It's not Aristotelianism. It's not Plato's philosophy anymore. It's Catholicism. So what's the point? It's deceptive also because when you do that and the person's reading Aristotle's philosophy, he thinks Aristotle was a good Catholic. The guy was a believer. He's great. You're deceiving them. You're not letting them know this is not what Aristotle believed. And then the person can go and pick up some of Aristotle's book on his own and read it and fall into his errors and heresies. It's a deception. I don't need to purge the philosophical works. The only reason you can read philosophical works is for historical purposes, educational, or to refute them. Here he's saying that you can study them to be enlightened and edified as long as you purge them. But what's the purpose? If I purge it, I'm not left. That's not Aristotle anymore. It's Catholicism. It's a giant lie. All right, now we're going to pick up some more of his idolatries and heresies, apostate Pope Gregory IX. In 1228, he also wrote a letter against the University of Paris because they were overdoing it with philosophy. People were complaining. In that letter, he only correctly condemns one thing. He condemns the use of philosophical terminologies, which I call scholastic babble. He does a good job on that. But what does he do? While he says, you're using the philosophical works of Aristotle and Plato too much, they're overwhelming the faith. Make sure you keep them as handmaids instead of faith. He held a handmaid, that you can still learn the philosophical works as handmaids to theology. He was teaching that in 1228, and he taught it, and he didn't say that it needed to be purged of its errors in 1228. In 1231 now he's saying, okay, you can study this, but now it needs to be purged of its errors. He didn't teach that in 1228. Did not teach that. He did not teach it. He changed his mind maybe 2 years later because some people were complaining to him. All right? So he's already a heretic in 1228 for that alone, a formal heretic, an idolater. Now, in his 1231 decree that he addressed to the University of Paris when it was reopening, he told them, you must purge the philosophical works of Aristotle, Plato, and the philosophers. Purge them of their errors. But then he goes on to say, however, the Priscian grammar should be studied by everybody. And doesn't say it needs to be purged. The Priscian grammar is an abomination if you read it. Priscian grammar teaches about mythology, philosophy, Jupiter, Venus, Apollo. It gives all the examples in there. And he said that never needed to be purged in the same 1231 decree. We're going to read some proof on that. Here's the 1231 decree of apostate anti-Pope Gregory IX on the statutes for the University of Paris. We order that the master in art shall always read one lecture on Priscian and one book after another in regular courses. All right, we're now going to give some quotes from the unpurged Priscian grammar to show you what this apostate anti-Pope Gregory IX was promoting. I got all this locations and everything in my book. So, when you get the book, you're going to see where all these are. It says, now Venus, a mother, fearful, and not with reason within her mind. Another portion says, Jupiter launches rain and snow from woods to sea. While you're learning grammar, you're learning this crap, you see. This Venus brought her face veiled in dark mist. This, with its hidden curative powers, she steeped in the river water. Another quote, a queen whom Jupiter grants the right to found a new city. Elsewhere, they pressed on with a chariot from Mars with winged wheels. Now, this is all taught in the Christian grammar. And the Postulated Pope Gregory IX is saying, you can teach this, it's very good, and that doesn't need to be purged. You can teach it just the way it is. Now, again, that's how I said these people began, that's how the theologians began to get infected. You're pretending that's like having your kid learn grammar and you got pornographic stuff in there and dirty pictures and filthy descriptions of sexual lust and all that in there. But now, let's go to a true pope, a holy pope, a saint pope, a great pope with the same name as Gregory, St. Gregory the Great. And let's see what he teaches about it. Now, Priscian was around in the 6th century. And he was around in the time of Pope St. Gregory the Great. And his grammar's book was out. And at that time, some monks were learning grammar, or bishops, from the Priscian grammar. And Donatus also had a bad grammar book. But here's what a true pope teaches about this book that the other one's allowing. This is Pope St. Gregory the Great in his book 11, letter 54 to Desiderius, Bishop of Gaul, 6th century. Gregory to Desiderius. It came to our ears what we cannot mention without shame, that the fraternity is in the habit of expounding grammar to certain persons. This thing we took so much amiss and so strongly disapproved it that we changed what we had said before into groaning and sadness, because he was praising him before that. Since the praises of Christ cannot find room in one mouth with the praises of Jupiter. And consider thyself what a grave and heinous offense it is for bishops to sing what is not becoming even for a religious layman. Whence, if hereafter what has been reported to us should prove evidently to be false, and it should be clear that you do not apply yourself to trifles in secular literature, we shall give thanks to our God, who has not permitted your heart to be stained with the blasphemous praises of the abominable. He calls this Priscian grammar abominable, blasphemous, grievous offense against God. Gregory IX says, study it and give it to all your kids. We got two popes here. Choose your pope. One's true and one's not. You can't have it both ways. Choose your pope. And this stuff is now being taught to everybody. He caught this right away. He hated all kinds of philosophy, St. Gregory the Great. Now, another point I want to make is that when it comes to courses in logic, dialectics, rhetoric, and grammar, you don't really need to take a course in these things to be a good Catholic. There were many uneducated Catholics that didn't even know how to read, that had the faith, they did miracles, they were logical, they knew how to refute and debate, they didn't have to know how to read, they didn't have to be perfect in grammar, they didn't have to be perfect in dialect, because by the natural law anyway, all men have logic. They all know how to refute. They don't have to go to school for it. So you don't need to take a course for it. My point is, I'm not putting down people who do take courses. If you're going to be a theologian, you're going to write a lot, and you want to write a little better, speak a little better, that's fine. But my main point is you don't really need to take a course in it. You could if you want, but you don't need it. If you're a lot of people, your best Catholics were uneducated. As a matter of fact, St. Peter and St. John, the two apostles, were uneducated, and even St. Paul was not educated in the ways of the Greeks. They weren't educated in the ways of the Greeks, and they had the most logic, the best dialectic, the best grammar, rhetoric, even though it might not have been according to the philosophical methods. So my point is, a lot of people have this just by the natural law. They don't need to take a course in it. We read about this. St. Augustine talks about this in the City of God. The very manner in which the world's faith was won is found to be even more incredible if we consider it. Men uninstructed in any branch of liberal education, without any of the refinement of heathen learning, unskilled in grammar, not armed with dialect, not adorned with rhetoric, but plain fishermen, and very few in number. These were the men whom Christ sent, whom the nets of faith to the sea of this world, and thus took out of every race so many fishes, even of the philosophers themselves, and they never took any courses in this. They idolized the learning to such a degree that as long as a guy was educated, just no matter, even if he was using false dialectics, false grammar, but he was educated, they idolized him and thought he was good. They put down people with simple faith. We read from a commentary, Catholic commentary on Ecclesiasticus 6:23. The verse is this: "For wisdom opened the mouth of the dumb and made the tongues of infants eloquent." And we read the commentary on that. Many prefer learning before piety, but St. Augustine says, "The unlearned rise and take the kingdom of heaven, while we with our learning, devoid of heart or charity, behold, we fall into the dirt. That's in his Confessions, 8:19. What does King David say in Psalm 70, 15 to 17? Who was not educated in the science of the Greeks. None of the faithful Jews were. None of the apostles were. They never took these courses, and they were the cornerstones of the Catholic Church. About King David, we read in Psalm 70, 15 to 17, my mouth shall show forth thy justice, thy salvation all the day long, because I have not known learning. He means the pagan learning of these pagan Greeks. I will enter into the powers of the Lord. O Lord, I will be mindful of thy justice alone. Thou hast taught me, O God, from my youth. Until now, I will declare thy wonderful works. Catholic commentary on that verse is, as much as to say, I build not upon human learning, but only upon the power and justice of God. David had not received a polite education, and he disapproved of Ahithophel's worldly prudence. Now, with all this in mind, that we've learned certain things about philosophy, when I use the word philosophy in the rest of this lecture and in my book, I use it according to the most common way people understand it. When you talk about philosophy, people understand it to be the philosophy of the unbelievers. The philosophical works of Aristotle, Plato, Cicero, Virgil. That's what I talk about when I mention philosophy. That's the philosophy that St. Paul condemns. I'm not talking about the true philosophy of Catholicism. So when in this lecture, unless I say otherwise, when I'm talking about philosophy, I'm referring to the philosophy of the unbelievers, the evil philosophy.